It was a typical Tuesday morning in downtown Houston, the kind where the summer heat already had everyone's shirts sticking to their backs by 9 a.m. Paramedic Michael Thompson was just finishing his coffee when the emergency call came in. Multiple vehicle collision on Interstate 45, possible cardiac involvement. His partner, David Chen, was already firing up the ambulance before dispatch finished the details. The scene they arrived at was chaos. 3 cars tangled like crushed aluminum cans, with smoke rising from one of the engines. Michael immediately spotted an older man slumped over his steering wheel in a black Mercedes. His training kicked in as he grabbed his medical bag, while David radioed for additional support. The older man was well-dressed in an expensive suit, but right now his gray complexion and irregular breathing were the only things that mattered to Michael. As he carefully assessed the patient, he noticed the man's designer watch and a small pin on his lapel, something official-looking that Michael didn't have time to examine closely. "Sir, can you hear me?" Michael called out, checking vital signs. The man's pulse was weak and irregular. Years of experience told Michael this wasn't just from the crash, this was a serious cardiac episode. He needed to get this patient to the hospital fast. That's when he heard the screech of tires. A police cruiser pulled up, and out stepped Officer William Parker, his face already red with anger. Michael had seen this officer before at other scenes, and the encounters were never pleasant. The whispers among the emergency response community about Parker's behavior, especially toward minority first responders, weren't just rumors. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" Parker shouted, storming over to the Mercedes. His hand was already resting on his belt, a posture Michael had learned to be wary of. "Sir, I'm a paramedic attending to a critical patient," Michael responded calmly, continuing to prepare the patient for transport. "We need to get him to Memorial Hospital immediately. He's showing signs of cardiac." "Step away from the vehicle," Parker interrupted, moving closer. The veins in his neck were bulging, and despite the situation's urgency, Michael could see the officer wasn't interested in explanations. "Officer, I understand your concern, but this man needs immediate medical attention," Michael tried again, reaching for his ID badge. But before he could grab it, Parker's face twisted with rage. "I said step away." And then it happened. Parker's fist connected with Michael's jaw, sending him stumbling backward against the car. The medical equipment clattered to the ground, and David, who had been preparing the stretcher, froze in shock. The crowd that had gathered around the accident scene gasped. Several people had their phones out, recording everything. But Michael's focus remained on his patient, even as he tasted blood in his mouth. His years of training and dedication wouldn't let him abandon someone in need, not even after being assaulted. "Officer Parker," came David's steady voice as he approached with the stretcher. "The patient in this vehicle is showing signs of a massive cardiac event. We need to transport him now, or he might not make it to the hospital." Parker seemed ready to escalate further when a weak voice came from inside the car. "Willie, is that you, son?" The color drained from Parker's face as he finally really looked, at the man in the Mercedes. It was his father, State Senator Thomas Parker, one of Texas's most influential politicians. The realization hit Officer Parker like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, watching as Michael, despite his now swollen jaw, professionally and efficiently moved his father onto the stretcher with David's help. As they loaded the senator into the ambulance, Michael could see Officer Parker's hands shaking. The crowd was still recording, their phones capturing every moment of the officer's transformation from aggressor to a son watching his father fight for his life. The last thing Michael saw before the ambulance doors closed was Officer Parker's face, a complex mix of shame, fear, and the dawning understanding of what his prejudices had almost cost him. But Michael had no time to dwell on it. His patient needed him, and that's what mattered most. David hit the sirens, and as they sped toward Memorial Hospital, Michael focused on keeping the senator stable. Despite everything that had just happened, his hands were steady as he worked. Because that's what real heroes do. They rise above the chaos and help those in need, no matter what. The next few hours felt like a blur at Memorial Hospital's emergency department. Michael's jaw was throbbing, but he stayed to fill out his patient reports, making sure every detail of Senator Parker's treatment was properly documented. The emergency room was buzzing with whispers about what had happened at the accident scene. Videos of the incident were already spreading across social media. Local news vans had started gathering outside the hospital, their satellite dishes reaching up into the darkening sky like maple trees. Michael could see their lights flashing through the staff room window as he held an ice pack to his face. "You should press charges," said Linda, one of the veteran nurses who had been treating Senator Parker. She handed Michael a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. "What that officer did, it's not right, and you know it's not the first time he's done something like this." Michael stared into his coffee cup, watching the cream swirl into patterns. "How's the senator doing?" he asked, changing the subject. It was just like him, always putting others first. "Stable," Linda replied. "The cardiac team says you got in here just in time. If you hadn't recognized the signs and acted as quickly as you did," she let the sentence hang in the air. Outside the staff room, they could hear the hospital coming to life with a different kind of energy. Heavy footsteps and official-sounding voices echoed down the corridor. The police chief had arrived, along with several internal affairs officers. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug like so many incidents before. Michael's phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Messages from fellow paramedics, friends, and even reporters looking for comments filled his screen. But one message made him pause. It was from David, his partner. "The dash cam footage from our ambulance is being reviewed. They can see everything, Michael. Everything." The hospital's security chief, Mr. Thompson, knocked on the staff room door. "There are some people who need to speak with you," he said quietly. "Take all the time you need, but they're waiting in the conference room whenever you're ready." As Michael walked down the hospital corridor, he could feel eyes following him. Some were filled with admiration, others with concern, and a few with something that looked like guilt. Probably officers who had worked with Parker and seen signs of his behavior before but had stayed silent. The conference room was packed. The police chief sat at one end of the table, his face grave. Internal affairs officers lined one wall, their notebooks ready. The hospital administrator stood near the window, phone in hand, probably dealing with the media circus that was building outside. "Mr. Rodriguez," the police chief began, using Michael's last name formally. "We've reviewed the body camera footage, your ambulance's dash cam, and multiple civilian videos of the incident. We need your statement, but first, I want to apologize on behalf of the department." Michael took a deep breath. He could feel the weight of the moment, the opportunity to make real change. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every first responder who had ever faced discrimination, every professional who had been judged by their appearance rather than their actions. "Chief," Michael started, his voice steady despite his swollen jaw, "I have one condition for my statement. I want this incident to lead to real changes in how emergency services work together. No more power trips, no more prejudices getting in the way of saving lives." The room fell silent. Through the window, camera flashes from the media outside created a strange strobe effect, like lightning in slow motion. The chief leaned forward, his face showing genuine interest. "I've been a paramedic for 12 years, Michael continued. "I've worked with amazing police officers who would give their lives to protect others. What happened today isn't just about one officer's actions, it's about a system that sometimes forgets we're all on the same team." As Michael spoke, hospital staff began to gather outside the conference room windows, watching history unfold. Among them was Linda, who gave him an encouraging nod. This was the moment when a simple paramedic became something more, a voice for change. Meanwhile, in another part of the hospital, Officer Parker sat alone in the ICU waiting room, his head in his hands. His father's words from earlier kept echoing in his mind. "Willie, is that you, son?" The shame of what he'd done, what he'd almost prevented, was eating him alive. The sun was setting outside the hospital windows, casting long shadows through the corridors. But inside, something new was dawning. A chance for real change, sparked by one moment of confrontation that could have ended very differently if not for the professionalism of a paramedic who chose to put saving lives above everything else. As the morning sun peeked through the hospital blinds the next day, Senator Parker was showing strong signs of recovery. The cardiac unit was quieter now, with only the steady beep of monitors and the soft footsteps of nurses breaking the silence. In the corner of the room, Officer Parker hadn't moved from his chair all night, his uniform wrinkled and his eyes red from lack of sleep. Michael hadn't planned on visiting, but his shift was starting and the senator's room was on his daily rounds. He knocked softly on the doorframe, medical chart in hand. The moment Officer Parker looked up, the tension in the room became thick enough to cut with a knife. "How are you feeling, Senator?" Michael asked professionally, checking the monitors and updating the chart. His jaw was still swollen, a visible reminder of yesterday's events. The senator, looking much better than he had in the ambulance, studied Michael's face carefully. "So you're the paramedic, my son." He paused, choosing his words carefully, "the one who saved my life." Officer Parker shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The shame on his face was evident, but he couldn't bring himself to meet Michael's eyes. The news was everywhere by now. Local stations had been running the story all night, and national media was picking it up too. "I was just doing my job, sir," Michael replied, adjusting the senator's IV line. "How's the chest pain today?" But the senator wasn't interested in talking about his health. "Willie," he said firmly, addressing his son, "get up and face this man properly." Officer Parker slowly stood up, his movements stiff from sitting all night. For the first time since the incident, he looked directly at Michael. The confident, aggressive officer from yesterday was gone, replaced by someone who looked lost and broken. "My father," Officer Parker started, his voice cracking. "The doctors said if you hadn't recognized the sign so quickly, if you hadn't." He couldn't finish the sentence. Outside the room, hospital staff pretended not to watch the scene unfolding. News crews were still camped outside the hospital, but this private moment would never make it to their cameras. "You know," the senator spoke up, his voice stronger now, "I've spent 30 years in politics. I've written laws, made speeches about justice and equality. And here I am, watching my own son become everything I'd fought against." Officer Parker flinched at his father's words. Michael continued his medical checks, giving them space for this family moment while remaining professionally focused. "Dad," Officer Parker tried to speak, but the senator raised his hand. "No, Willie, you need to listen. This man," he gestured to Michael, "did his job perfectly despite your actions. He put aside what you did to him to save my life. That's real character. That's real strength." The hospital corridor outside had grown quiet. Even the usual morning bustle seemed to have paused, as if the whole floor was holding its breath. "Mr. Rodriguez," Officer Parker said formally, using Michael's last name, "I know an apology isn't enough. What I did, there's no excuse. I let prejudice cloud my judgment, and I attacked someone who was trying to help." Michael finished updating the chart and finally turned to face Officer Parker fully. "You're right," he said calmly. "An apology isn't enough. But change is possible if you're willing to do the work." The senator watched this exchange with intense interest, his political mind already working despite his condition. "Willie," he said, "you have a choice to make. You can let this define you as the officer who assaulted a paramedic, or you can use it to become something better." Just then, David appeared at the door. "Michael, we've got a call. Multi-car pileup on the freeway." Without hesitation, Michael moved toward the door, but stopped for a moment. "Officer Parker," he said, "next time you see a first responder at a scene, remember this moment. Remember that we're all here to help." As Michael hurried down the corridor with David, they could hear the senator's voice. "Now, son, let's talk about what real public service looks like." The emergency radio crackled with details about the new accident, but Michael's mind was already focused on the job ahead. Behind him, he left a room where 3 lives had been changed forever, not just by a medical emergency, but by the complicated web of human prejudice, redemption, and the simple act of doing what's right regardless of circumstances. The next few days brought a whirlwind of attention to Memorial Hospital. News vans remained parked outside, their crews hoping to catch anyone involved in what was now being called the Parker incident. The story had gone viral, with social media exploding with opinions and debates. But inside the hospital, real life continued as usual. Emergencies didn't stop for viral videos. Michael was finishing up paperwork in the break room when Chief Thompson from the police department walked in. The room suddenly felt smaller, with other staff members pretending not to watch while scrolling through their phones. "Mr. Rodriguez," the chief said, taking a seat across from him, "we need to talk about the hearing tomorrow." Michael looked up from his reports. The department had scheduled a formal hearing to address Officer Parker's actions, and Michael was expected to testify. The thought made his stomach turn, not because he was afraid, but because he knew his words would affect many lives. "Chief, I've been thinking about that, Michael replied, closing his folder. I've made some notes about the changes we need in emergency response protocols. The chief leaned forward, genuinely interested. This wasn't going to be just another disciplinary hearing. It was an opportunity for real reform. Outside, an ambulance siren wailed as it pulled into the emergency bay, a reminder that life and death didn't wait for bureaucracy. Just then, David rushed into the break room. Michael, you need to see this. He held up his phone, showing a social media post that was rapidly gaining traction. It was a compilation video, dozens of incidents from across the country showing similar confrontations between police and emergency medical services. It's not just about Officer Parker anymore, David said quietly. People are finally talking about the bigger picture. The chief watched the video, his face growing more serious with each clip. This is exactly why tomorrow's hearing is so important, he said. We need to set a precedent. As they discussed the hearing, Linda walked in with fresh coffee for everyone. She'd been following the story closely, and her perspective as a veteran nurse added another layer to the conversation. You know what's interesting? She said, setting down the cups. Since this happened, I've noticed a change in how police officers interact with us here in the ER. Then more mindful. The conversation was interrupted by Michael's phone ringing. It was Senator Parker's office. The senator had been discharged, but wanted to meet with Michael before the hearing. The room fell silent as Michael took the call. Yes, Senator, Michael said professionally. I understand. Yes, I'll be there. After hanging up, Michael explained to the others. The senator had called an emergency meeting with the police commissioner, the head of emergency medical services, and several community leaders. He wanted Michael there too. This is your chance, David said, patting Michael's shoulder. Make it count. Later that afternoon, Michael found himself in a conference room at City Hall. The walls were lined with portraits of past city leaders, their eyes seeming to watch the proceedings with interest. Senator Parker, looking much better than he had in the hospital, sat at the head of the table. Gentlemen, the senator began, what happened to Mr. Rodriguez isn't just about one incident or one officer. It's about a system that needs fixing. The police commissioner shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Senator, we've already implemented new training protocols. Not enough, the senator interrupted. My son's actions opened my eyes to a problem that's been ignored for too long. Mr. Rodriguez, please share your recommendations. Michael pulled out the notebook he'd been carrying since the incident. In it, he'd written down every suggestion from fellow paramedics, nurses, and even police officers who'd reached out to him privately. We need joint training sessions, Michael started. Police, paramedics, firefighters, we all need to understand each other's roles better. We need clear protocols for scene management that respect everyone's expertise. The meeting went on for hours. Outside, the sun set over the city skyline, casting long shadows through the conference room windows. But inside, something bright was taking shape, a new approach to emergency response that would protect both first responders and the public they served. As Michael drove home that evening, he passed the spot where the incident had happened. The skid marks were still visible on the pavement, but instead of feeling anger or resentment, he felt hope. Sometimes it took a moment of darkness to spark real change. The hearing room was packed early the next morning. Every wooden bench was filled with police officers, paramedics, reporters, and community members. The air conditioning hummed overhead, barely keeping up with the body heat from the crowd. Michael sat in the front row, his paramedic uniform pressed and perfect, next to David, who had taken the day off to be there. At the center of the room, Officer Parker sat alone at a small table, his badge and gun already surrendered. He looked different now, humbled, smaller somehow in his civilian clothes. His father, Senator Parker, sat in the gallery behind him, his face a mask of stern composure. Hearing number 2024-147 is now in session, announced the department secretary. The Police Review Board, 5 senior officers and 2 civilian oversight members, filed in and took their seats at the raised platform. The department's legal counsel laid out the charges: assault on a medical professional, conduct unbecoming an officer, racial discrimination. With each charge, the room seemed to grow more tense. But this wasn't just about punishment. Everyone knew that. When it was Michael's turn to testify, he walked to the witness stand feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on him. His jaw had healed, but the memory was still fresh. "Mr. Rodriguez," the board chairman began, "please tell us in your own words what happened that day." Michael cleared his throat and looked directly at the board. "I want to start by saying something important," he said. "This isn't just about what happened to me. It's about every first responder who's ever been disrespected or endangered while trying to save lives." He told the story again, but this time he included details he hadn't shared before. He talked about other incidents he'd witnessed, times when ego and prejudice had gotten in the way of emergency response. He described how precious seconds could mean the difference between life and death. "When I was treating Senator Parker," Michael continued, "I didn't see him as a politician. I didn't see Officer Parker as a threat. I saw people who needed help. That's what we're trained to do. That's what we all should do." The room was silent except for the scratch of reporters' pens and the quiet clicks of camera shutters. Even the usual whispers and shuffles had stopped. Officer Parker, who had been staring at the table, finally looked up. His eyes were red, and his hands trembled slightly as he asked permission to speak. "I spent the last week thinking about what I did," Officer Parker said, his voice shaking. "I've watched that video 100 times, trying to understand why I acted that way. The truth is, I was wrong. I let prejudice and power cloud my judgment." He turned to face Michael directly. "You saved my father's life despite what I did to you. You showed more courage and professionalism than I did. I don't deserve to wear the badge anymore." The board members exchanged glances. This wasn't following the usual script of these hearings, where officers typically defended their actions or made excuses. Senator Parker stood up from his seat. "If I may address the board," he said, his political authority evident in his voice. The chairman nodded. "My son's actions were inexcusable," the senator stated firmly. "But firing him isn't enough. We need systematic change. Mr. Rodriguez and I have been working on a proposal." Michael pulled out the document they prepared. "A comprehensive plan for joint training between police and emergency medical services, new protocols for scene management, and a community oversight committee for emergency response." "This incident opened my eyes," the senator continued, "not just as a father, but as a lawmaker. We have an opportunity here to prevent this from happening again." The hearing continued for hours. Officer Parker accepted his suspension without pay and agreed to undergo extensive retraining if he was allowed to return to the force at all. But more importantly, the board voted unanimously to implement the new training protocols. As people filed out of the hearing room, Michael felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Linda from the hospital. "You did good in there," she said with a smile. "Real change starts with people brave enough to speak up." Outside, the media was waiting with cameras and microphones, but Michael slipped out a side door with David. They had a shift starting in an hour, and somewhere in the city, someone would need their help. "You know," David said as they walked to the ambulance, "this whole thing might actually make a difference." Michael nodded, checking his medical kit out of habit. "That's the hope. But right now, we've got work to do." 3 months after the hearing, the changes were already visible at emergency scenes across the city. On a busy Thursday afternoon, Michael pulled up to a car accident on Main Street. The scene looked like a flashback. Multiple vehicles, scared bystanders, and police cars with flashing lights. But something was different this time. The police officer at the scene, a young rookie named Officer Wilson, immediately waved the ambulance through to the most critical patient. "Paramedics have priority," she called out, keeping the gathering crowd back. This was one of the new protocols in action. Michael caught a glimpse of Officer Parker among the backup units. He was back on limited duty, wearing a trainee badge again despite his years of service. Their eyes met briefly as Michael rushed past with his medical kit. Parker gave a respectful nod and continued directing traffic. "Treatment area is clear," David announced, setting up their equipment. The new joint training meant everyone knew their roles. No more power struggles, no more confusion about who was in charge of what. As they worked to stabilize a young mother trapped in her car, Michael noticed how smoothly everything was running. Firefighters were cutting through the wreckage while police kept the scene secure. The paramedics had clear access to do their job. Linda, who happened to be passing by on her way to work, stopped to watch. "Would you look at that?" she said to another nurse. "It's like watching a different department entirely." Later that evening, at the monthly joint training session, Michael stood in front of a mixed group of police officers, firefighters, and paramedics. The training center's walls were now covered with new procedure posters, many featuring lessons learned from the Parker incident. Scene management isn't about power, Michael explained to the group. It's about working together to save lives. Each of us has specific skills, and when we respect that, everything works better. Officer Parker sat in the back row, taking notes. He'd become one of the most dedicated students in these sessions. His experience had transformed him from a problem officer into an advocate for change. During the break, Senator Parker made a surprise visit. He'd been instrumental in pushing through the new policies, even using his own experience as a testimony before the state legislature. Mr. Rodriguez, the senator called out, walking with a much stronger stride than that day in the ambulance. Got a minute? They stepped into the hallway, where the senator pulled out some papers. The governor is signing the new First Responder Cooperation Act next week. Your suggestions made it into the final version. Michael looked at the document, remembering all the late nights he'd spent drafting proposals with David and other first responders. What had started as one ugly incident had grown into statewide reform. There's more, the senator continued. They want you to head the new training program, statewide implementation. Before Michael could respond, alarms started blaring. A major incident was unfolding downtown. Everyone, police, firefighters, and paramedics, moved in perfect coordination, heading to their vehicles. At the scene, a high-rise fire with multiple casualties, Michael watched the new system in action. Police secured the area while firefighters tackled the blaze. Paramedics were given clear access to victims, with police and fire working together to help them reach people trapped on higher floors. Officer Parker was there too, coordinating with Michael's team to get emergency vehicles in and out smoothly. No ego, no power struggle, just professionals working together to save lives. You know, David said as they loaded another patient into their ambulance, sometimes good things come from bad situations. As the sun set over the city skyline, casting an orange glow on the emergency lights, Michael thought about how far they'd come. The incident that could have divided them had instead brought them together, making them all better at their jobs. Back at the station, after all the patients were safely delivered to hospitals, Michael found a note in his locker. It was from Officer Parker. Thank you for showing me a better way to serve. 1 year after the incident, Memorial Hospital's main conference room was packed for a special ceremony. The walls were decorated with photos showing the evolution of emergency services in the city, including a powerful image of police officers and paramedics working side by side at a major accident scene. Michael stood at the podium, looking out at faces both familiar and new. The First Responder Cooperation Program had grown beyond anyone's expectations, spreading to neighboring cities and even other states. News cameras lined the back wall, but this time they were here to cover success, not scandal. A year ago, Michael began, we faced a moment that could have torn us apart. Instead, it brought us together. His eyes met Officer Parker's in the crowd. Parker was back on full duty now, but with a new role, heading the police department's community relations unit. The ceremony was to celebrate the program's first graduating class. 50 officers, 30 paramedics, and 20 firefighters had completed the enhanced joint training. But more importantly, they'd learned to see each other as partners, not rivals. Linda sat in the front row, beaming like a proud mother. She'd been instrumental in extending the program to include hospital staff, creating a seamless chain of emergency care from scene to hospital. Next to her, David couldn't stop grinning. He'd just been promoted to training coordinator for the paramedic division. Senator Parker took the stage next, walking confidently with no trace of his cardiac episode from a year ago. Sometimes, he said, it takes a personal experience to open our eyes. My son's mistake could have ended in tragedy. Instead, it sparked a revolution in emergency services. The senator gestured to a large screen behind him, where statistics told the story. Response times had improved by 30%. Conflicts between services had dropped to near zero. Patient survival rates were up significantly. But the most powerful numbers showed a dramatic increase in trust between emergency services and the community they served. Officer Parker's turn to speak came next. He stood at the podium, took a deep breath, and looked directly at Michael. "A year ago, I was the problem," he said honestly. "I let prejudice and power corrupt my judgment, but thanks to one paramedic's professionalism and forgiveness, I learned to be a better officer and a better person." The ceremony continued with presentations of new Joint Service Badges, a symbol of unity between all emergency services. As Michael pinned badges on graduates, he remembered that day on the highway, how different things could have been if he'd let anger take over. After the ceremony, outside the hospital, a young black rookie police officer approached Michael. "Sir," she said, "your story, it's why I joined the force. I wanted to be part of this change." Later that evening, at a small celebration dinner, David raised his glass. "To Michael," he said, "who turned a punch into progress." But Michael shook his head. "To all of us," he corrected. "Every person in this room chose to be part of the solution." As they celebrated, emergency calls still came in. Teams still rushed out to help people in need. But now they moved as one unit, each person respecting the other's roles and expertise. The old tensions were gone, replaced by a shared mission to serve and protect. The local news that night showed clips from the ceremony, but the real story was happening on the streets. At a late-night accident scene, Officer Parker and Michael worked together. Their past conflict transformed into a powerful partnership. "You know what's funny?" Parker said as they finished up. "Now when I arrive at a scene and see paramedics, I feel relieved. I know we're all on the same team." Michael smiled, packing up his medical kit. "That's what change looks like," he said. "One scene, one shift, one day at a time." As they drove back to their stations under a star-filled sky, both men knew that their story would continue to inspire others, not just as a lesson about what went wrong, but as proof that people can change, systems can improve, and sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes. The city slept peacefully that night, protected by people who had learned to work together, respect each other, and put service above ego. And somewhere, a new recruit was reading about the Parker incident in their training manual, learning how one moment of conflict led to a revolution in emergency services.